Section 61 of Narratives of Colored Americans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Narratives of Colored Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood. Temptation Resisted and Honesty Rewarded. From Dilwyn's Anecdotes. A poor chimney-sweeper's boy was employed at the house of a lady of rank to sweep the chimney of the room in which she usually dressed. When finding himself on the hearth of a richly furnished dressing-room, and perceiving no one there, he waited a few moments to take a view of the beautiful things in the apartment. A gold watch, richly set with diamonds, particularly caught his attention, and he could not forbear taking it in his hand. Immediately the wish rose in his mind. "Ah, if you had such a one!" After a pause he said to himself, "But if I take it I shall be a thief, and yet," continued he, "nobody would know it. Nobody sees me. Nobody. Does not God see me, who is present everywhere?" Overcome by these thoughts, a cold shivering seized him. "No," said he, putting down the watch, "I would much rather be poor and keep my good conscience, than rich and become a rascal." At these words he hastened back into the chimney. The lady, who was in the room adjoining, having overheard the conversation with himself, sent for him the next morning, and thus accosted him. "My little friend, why did you not take the watch yesterday?" The boy fell on his knees, speechless and astonished. "I heard everything you said," continued her ladyship. "Thank God for enabling you to resist this temptation, and be watchful over yourself for the future. From this moment you shall be in my service. I will both maintain and clothe you. Nay, more, procure you good instruction, which will assist to guard you from the danger of similar temptations." The boy burst into tears. He was anxious to express his gratitude, but could not. The lady strictly kept her promise, and had the pleasure of seeing this poor chimney-sweeper grow up a good, pious, and intelligent man. An Indian, being among his white neighbors, asked for a little tobacco to smoke, and one of them, having some loose in his pocket, gave him a handful. The day following, the Indian came back, inquiring for the donor, saying he had found $0.25 among the tobacco. Being told that, as it was given him, he might as well keep it, he answered, pointing to his breast, "I got a good man and a bad man here, and the good man say, 'If it ain't yours, you must return it to its owner.' The bad man say, 'Why, he gave it to you, and it is your own now.' The good man say, 'That's not right. The tobacco is yours, not the money.' The bad man say, 'Never mind, you got it, go buy some dram.' The good man say, 'No, you must not do so.' So I don't know what to do, and I think I go to sleep. But the good man and the bad keep talking all night and trouble me, and now I bring the money back, I feel good." Another Indian related that, having got some money, he was, on his way home, tempted to stop at a tavern and buy some rum. "But," said he, pointing to his breast, "I have a good boy and a bad boy here." And the good boy say, "John, don't you stop there." The bad one say, "Poor John, never mind, you love a good dram." The good boy say, "No, John, you know what a fool you made yourself when you got drunk there before. Don't do so again." When I come to the tavern, the bad boy say, "Come, John, take one dram, it won't hurt you." The good one say, "No, John, if you take one dram, then you take another." Then I don't know what to do, and the good boy say, "Run, John, hard as you can." So I run away, and then, be sure, I feel very glad. End of section 61.
Section 62 of Narratives of Coloured Americans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Narratives of Coloured Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood. Section 62. The Good Old Indian. Captain James Smith relates that he was taken prisoner by the Indians in the year 1755, and lived for several years among them. At one time he lived with an old man named Nichole and his little son Nungani. They were quite alone, and there were not many inhabitants for many miles around. The old man was too lame to go out hunting. It was winter, they had no victuals. The snow was on the ground, and so frozen as to make a great noise when walked on, which frightened away the deer, and the captain could not shoot anything for some time. He says, "After I had hunted for 2 days without eating anything, and had very short allowance for some days before, I returned late in the evening, faint and weary. When I came into our hut, the old man asked what success. I told him not any. He asked me if I was not very hungry. I replied that the keen appetite seemed in some measure abated, but I was both faint and weary. He commanded his little son to bring me something to eat, and he brought me a kettle with some bones and broth. After eating a few mouthfuls, my appetite violently returned, and I thought the victuals had a most agreeable relish, although it was only fox and wildcat bones which lay about the ground, which the ravens and turkey buzzards had picked. These Nungani had collected and boiled until the sinews that remained on them would strip off. I speedily finished my allowance, and when I had ended my sweet repast, the old man asked me how I felt. I told him I was much refreshed. He then handed me his pipe and pouch, and told me to take a good smoke. I did so. He then said that he had something of importance to tell me if I was now composed and ready to hear it. I told him I was ready to hear him. He said, "The reason why I deferred my speech till now is because few men are in a right humour to hear good talk when they are very hungry, as they are then generally fretful and discomposed. But as you now appear to enjoy calmness and serenity of mind, I will communicate to you the thoughts of my heart, and those things I know to be true. Brother, as you have lived with the white people, you have not had the same advantage of knowing that the great being above feeds his people and gives them their meat in due season, as we Indians have, who are frequently out of provisions, and yet are wonderfully supplied. And that so frequently that it is evidently the hand of the Great Spirit that does this. Whereas the white people have commonly large stocks of tame cattle that they can kill when they please. And they also have barns and cribs filled with grain, and therefore have not the same opportunity of seeing that they are supported by the ruler of heaven and earth. Brother, I know that you are now afraid that we will all perish with hunger, but you have no just reason to fear this. I have been young, but I am now old. I have been frequently under the like circumstances that we now are, and some time or another in almost every year of my life. Yet I have hitherto been supported, and my wants supplied in time of need. Brother, the good Spirit sometimes suffers us to be in want, in order to teach us our dependence upon him, and to let us know that we are to love and serve him. Likewise to know that the worth of the favours that we receive, and also to make us thankful. Brother, be assured that you will be supplied with food, and that just in the right time. But you must continue diligent in the use of means. Go to sleep, and rise early in the morning and go a-hunting. Be strong and exert yourself like a man, and the Great Spirit will direct your way. The captain was thus encouraged to try again the next morning, though much disheartened and extremely hungry. He went a great distance before he could shoot anything, but at length he shot a buffalo cow, thus finding, as the good old Indian had said, that the Great Spirit had enabled him to provide for them just at the time of their distress. End of section 62. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 63 of Narratives of Coloured Americans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Leanne Khoh. Narratives of Coloured Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood. Faith of a Poor Blind Woman and African Schools in New York. Faith of a Poor Blind Woman. A person going to see a very aged woman of colour found a respectable-looking white girl sitting by her, reading the Bible for her. On inquiring of the old woman whether she could ever read, the visitor was answered, "Oh yes, mistress, and I used to read a great deal in that book," pointing to a Bible very much worn that lay on the table. "But now I am most blind, and the good girls read for me. But by and by, when I get on Zion's hill, I shall then see as well as anybody." The poor of this world are often found rich in faith, and their confidence in the wisdom and goodness of a bountiful Creator strong. How frequently, on visiting the abodes of the aged and the infirm, do we find this verified? One saying, when something is handed her, "The Lord has sent me this." Another, "The Lord put it into my heart to be industrious and lay up something for old age," etc. African Schools in New York. The Clarkson Association for Instructing Adult Females of Color commenced in the spring of 1811 and was conducted 10 or 12 years by a number of young ladies of the Society of Friends. This was the first institution that came under the appellation of Sabbath School in this city, where there are now so many. It was taught on that day because those people had generally more leisure to attend than on other days of the week, but these benevolent ladies soon appropriated also one afternoon in the middle of the week for such as were at liberty to attend. There were a considerable number of aged women, as well as those in the prime of life, who learned to read and rejoiced greatly in the acquisition. There were also schools kept by young men for adults of colour of the other sex. There is one remarkable fact connected with the effects of this excellent school upon the moral condition of the coloured people. At every term of the Court of Sessions in this city, there are many coloured persons convicted of crimes and sent to the state prison or penitentiary. This school has now been in operation a number of years, and several thousands of scholars have received the benefit of a good thorough English education, and but 3 persons who have been educated here have been convicted in our criminal courts. Several girls who have received their education at this school have gone with their parents to Haiti, where they will be capable of teaching schools and may be of singular benefit. 2 interesting letters, written in a very fair, intelligible hand by one of these girls about 14 years old, have been received by E.J. Cox, extracts from which are here subjoined. Republic of Haiti, City of St. Domingo, September 29, 1824. Dear Teacher, with pleasure I hasten to inform you of our safe arrival in St. Domingo after a passage of 21 days. Mother and myself were very much afflicted with seasickness for about 9 or 10 days, but after that we enjoyed a little of the pleasures of our voyage. On our arrival, we were conducted by the captain of the port to the governor's house, where we were received by him with all the friendship that he could have received us with had we been intimately acquainted for years. After informing him of our intention of residing on the island, we were conducted to the residence of the second general in command, where we had our names registered. From thence we went to see the principal chapel in the city, to give a description of which it requires a far abler pen than mine. She, however, mentions many particulars. but you cannot form an idea of it unless you could see for yourself. After we had viewed the church throughout, we were conducted to our lodging, at which place we are at present. Since we have been here, my sampler and bench cover have been seen by a number of ladies and gentlemen, and have been very much admired by all who have seen them. Dear teacher, notwithstanding we are hundreds of miles from each other, I hope you will not think that I shall forget you, or those kind friends, I mean the trustees, who have been so kind to me, for had it not been for them and yourself, perhaps I never should have known one half what I do, as respects my education, for which, for them and you, to God I shall offer up my humble prayers for your welfare, both in this life and that which is to come. I am, with respect, yours, Serena M. Baldwin. End of section 63.
Section number 64 of Narratives of Colored Americans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Narratives of Colored Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood. The Injured Africans, from the New York Observer, 1826. In our paper of the 21st of January, we inserted a communication from a correspondent giving an account of an age-colored woman who immigrated with her husband from New Orleans to this city last summer, bringing with her another colored woman whom she had rescued from slavery at the expense of her little all. The object of these poor people in coming to New York was simply to enjoy the privileges of the gospel without interruption. A benevolent gentleman of our acquaintance, whose feelings were much interested in the account which we published, and who has since repeatedly visited this interesting family, has put into our hands the following particulars of their history for publication. The name of the husband is Reuben, that of his wife, Betsy, and that of their companion, Fanny. Reuben Madison, the husband, was born in Virginia, near Port Royal, about the year 1781. His parents and all his connections in this country were slaves. His father died when he was about 7 years old. His mother is now living in Kentucky, enjoying freedom in her old age through the filial regard of Reuben, who purchased her liberty for $70. She is seriously disposed, but not a professor of religion. He has now 8 brothers and sisters living in Frankfort, Franklin County, Kentucky, all slaves, and all, excepting one, members of a Baptist church in that place. About a year after his conversion, Reuben was married to a slave who had been kidnapped in Maryland and sold to a planter in his neighborhood. She was also, hopefully, pious. While they lived together, she became the mother of 2 children. But about 4 years after their marriage, she and one of the children, aged 8 months, were sold without his knowledge and transported to a distant Spanish territory, and with so much secrecy that he had no opportunity even to bid her a last farewell. This, he said, was the severest trial of my life, a sense of sin only accepted. I mourned and cried and would not be comforted. After several months, however, the hope of meeting her and my children again in the kingdom of God, when we should never be separated, together with a promise from my master that I should at some future time go to see her, in some measure allayed my grief and permitted me to enjoy the consolations of religion. The other child is now a slave in Kentucky, though the father has often endeavored in vain to purchase his freedom. About 6 years since, having hired his time of his master for 5 years previous at $120 a year, Reuben succeeded, by trafficking in rags and in other ways in collecting a sum sufficient for the purchase of his own freedom, for which he paid $700, and not only so, but he was enabled, with his surplus earnings, to build a brick house and to provide it with convenient accommodations. By the dishonesty of his former master, however, all was taken from him. Thus, stripped of his property, he left Kentucky and went to New Orleans, that he might learn something from his wife and, if possible, find and redeem her. But he only succeeded in gaining the painful intelligence that she was dead. He there formed an acquaintance with his present wife, whose former name was Betsy Bond, and they were soon married. The circumstances of her life were briefly these. Betsy was born a slave near Hobbs Hole, Essex County, Virginia, about 1763, and was married to a slave at about the age of 20 years. By him, she had 3 children, one of which, together with her husband, died a few years after their marriage. Soon after their death, she was led to reflect on her lost state as a sinner, and after about 7 months of deep anxiety was enabled, as she trusts, to resign herself into the hands of her Savior and experience those consolations which he deigns to grant to the broken-hearted penitent. She gained the confidence and attachment of her mistress, who treated her with much kindness, and she was married to a pious servant of the family, where she remains about 9 years. At the close of this period, a planter from the vicinity of Natchez, coming to Alexandria in Virginia, where she then lived, for slaves, she was sold and carried with 8 others to this plantation, leaving her husband behind. Her new master treated her with great severity, and she was compelled to labor almost incessantly every day of the week, Sabbath not excepted. With this man she lived 19 years. He then died and left his slaves by will to another planter, who also dying soon after, she was again sold and transported to New Orleans, where she arrived about the year 1812. At the end of 2 years, this master also died, and when his slaves were about to be sold, Betsy succeeded with some difficulty in hiring her time, and in a little more than a year, by washing and other labor, she acquired sufficient property to purchase her freedom, for which she paid $250. Her youngest son and his wife, being also slaves in New Orleans, she hoped to obtain, by her industry and economy, money sufficient to purchase them also, but their master refused to part with them. Several years after a large number of slaves were brought to New Orleans from Virginia and were about to be offered for sale, and Fanny was among the number. Having accidentally become acquainted with her previous to the sale, and finding her a sister in Christ, Betsy's feelings were deeply interested, and she resolved to purchase her, and to treat her not as a slave, but as a child and companion. This determination she communicated to Fanny, and with the aid of a gentleman she succeeded in accomplishing her object. The price was $250. She paid $200, her all, and obtained a short credit for the remainder. Soon after this, her present husband, coming to New Orleans, as before stated, they were married, and the payment for Fanny was then completed. By their united industry, they were soon able to build a comfortable house, in which they set apart a room for religious purposes. Here they assembled with others every Sabbath for the worship of God. But being constantly exposed to disturbance in their worship, they felt a great desire to go to a free state, where they might enjoy religious privileges unmolested, where they could unite with Christian friends in social prayer and conversation, without a soldier, with a drawn sword stationed at their door. They fixed upon New York as the desired asylum, and having arranged their concerns, rented their house and collected their effects. They engaged and paid their passage, which was $70, and sailed from New Orleans about the 12th of July, 1825, with pleasing anticipations for a land of freedom and religious privileges. They suffered much on the voyage through the cruelty of the captain, being exposed without shelter during the whole of the passage, either on deck or in the longboat. In consequence of this exposure, both of the women were taken sick, and in this condition they arrived at New York and were landed on the wharf in a land of strangers, their money almost expended, and none to commiserate their sufferings. After a few days, however, Reuben succeeded in obtaining a miserable cellar in Chapel Street, at $60 annual rent, where he remained for some time, supporting the family in their sickness by his labor as a shoemaker and by the sale of some of his effects. On his arrival at this port, his first act was to grant entire freedom to Fanny, giving her liberty to live with him or to go where she pleased. She chose to remain with him, and she assisted in the support of the family by washing and other labor, and nursed her mistress, who was evidently declining with the consumption, occasioned doubtless by the severity of her treatment on the passage from New Orleans. Not being able to pay their rent in advance, owing to their sickness and other expenses, their landlord compelled them to quit their residence, and they have since been obliged to put up with still more miserable accommodations in a cellar on Elm Street. They appear to put their trust and confidence in God and express their entire belief that all their trials were designed for their good. They seem to be one in sentiment and feeling, and to manifest a spirituality of mind rarely to be found. Every little attention was most gratefully received, and the best of blessings were implored on him who bestowed it. With some assistance from the benevolent, and with what they may receive from New Orleans for rent, it is believed they may be provided with a comfortable house, and be introduced to those privileges which they so ardently desire. No one of the family can read, though they were all desirous to learn, and from a little attention which their friends had given them, it appears that they may be taught without difficulty. It is an affecting thought that the wrongs of this poor woman, which commenced at her birth, and were afflicted without interruption during the long years of slavery, still followed her on her passage to the land of freedom, and have been finally consummated in this city, the city of her hopes, her fancied asylum from the oppressor. End of section number 64. Read by Kevin Waters, Spring Hill, Florida, July 26, 2021. Section number 65 of Narratives of Colored Americans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Narratives of Colored Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood. Henry Boyd. From the Anti-Slavery Record. Henry Boyd was born a slave in Kentucky, of imposing stature, well-knit muscles, and the countenance of one of nature's noblemen. At the age of 18, he had so far won the confidence of his master that he not only consented to sell him the right and title to his freedom, but gave his own time to earn the money. With a general pass from his master, Henry made his way to the Kenhawa Salt Works, celebrated as the place where Senator Ewing of Ohio chopped out his education with his axe, and there too, with his axe, did Henry Boyd chop out his liberty. By performing double labor, he got double wages. In the daytime, he swung his axe upon the wood, and for half the night he tended the boiling salt kettles, sleeping the other half by their side. After having accumulated a sufficient sum, he returned to his master and paid it over for his freedom. He next applied himself to learn the trade of a carpenter and joiner. Such was his readiness to acquire the use of tools that he soon qualified himself to receive the wages of a journeyman. In Kentucky, prejudice does not forbid master mechanics to teach colored men their trades. He now resolved to quit the dominions of slavery and try his fortunes in a free state, and accordingly directed his steps to the city of Cincinnati. The journey reduced his purse to the last quarter of $1, but, with his tools on his back and the consciousness of his ability to use them, he entered the city with a light heart. Little did he dream of the reception he was to meet. There was work enough to be done in his line, but no master workman would employ a colored man. Day after day did Henry Boyd offer his services from shop to shop, but as often was he repelled, generally with insult, and once with a kick. At last, he found the shop of an Englishman, too recently arrived to understand the grand peculiarity of American feeling. This man put a plane into his hand and asked him to make proof of his skill. "This is in bad order," said Boyd, and with that he gave the instrument certain nice professional knocks with the hammer, till he brought it to suit his practiced eye. "Enough," said the Englishman. "I see you can use tools." Boyd, however, proceeded to dress a board in a very able and workmanlike manner, while the journeymen from a long line of benches gathered round with looks that bespoke a deep personal interest in the matter. "You may go to work," said the master of the shop, "right glad to employ such a good workman." The words had no sooner left his mouth than his American journeymen, unbuttoning their aprons, called, as one man, for the settlement of their wages. "What? What?" said the amazed Englishman. "What does this mean?" "It means that we will not work with a nigger," replied the journeyman. "But he is a first-rate workman." "But we won't stay in the same shop with a nigger. We are not in the habit of working with niggers." "Then I will build a shanty outside, and he shall work in that." No, we won't work for a boss who employs niggers. Pay us up and we'll be off." The poor master of the shop turned with a despairing look to Boyd. "You see how it is, my friend? My workmen will all leave me. I am sorry for it, but I can't hire you." Even at this repulse, our adventurer did not despair. There might still be mechanics in the outskirts of the city who had too few journeymen to be bound by their prejudices. His quarter of $1 had long since disappeared, but by carrying a traveler's trunk or turning his hand to any chance job, he contrived to exist till he had made application to every carpenter and journer in the city and its suburbs. Not one would employ him. By this time, the iron of prejudice, more galling than anything he had ever known of slavery, had entered his soul. He walked down to the river's bank below the city, and throwing himself upon the ground, gave way to an agony of despair. He had found himself the object of universal contempt. His plans were all frustrated, his hopes dashed, and his dear, bought freedom made of no effect. By such trials, weak minds are prostrated in abject and slavish servility, and stronger ones are made the enemies and depredators of society. It is only the highest class of moral heroes that come off like gold from the furnace. Of this class, however, was Henry Boyd. Recovering from his dejection, he surveyed the brawny muscles that strung his Herculean frame. A new design rushed into his mind, and new resolution filled his heart. He sprang upon his feet and walked firmly and rapidly towards the city, doubtless with aspirations that might have suited the words of the poet. Thy spirit, independence, let me share, Lord of the lion heart and eagle eye. The first object which attracted his eagle eye on reaching the city was one of the huge river boats laden with pig iron, drawn up to the landing. The captain of this craft was just inquiring of the merchant who owned its contents, for a hand to assist in unloading it. I am the very fellow for you, said Boyd, stripping off his coat, rolling up his sleeves, and laying hold of the work. Yes, sure enough, that is the very fellow for you, said the merchant. The resolution and the alacrity of Boyd interested him exceedingly, and during the 4 or 5 days in which a flotilla of boats were discharging their cargoes of pig iron with unaccustomed dispatch, he became familiar with his history, with the exception of all that pertained to his trade, which Boyd thought proper to keep to himself. In consequence, our adventurer next found himself promoted to the portership of the merchant's store, a post which he filled to great satisfaction. He had a hand and a head for everything, and an occasion was not long waiting to prove it. A joiner was engaged to erect a counter, but failing by a drunken frolic, the merchant was disappointed and vexed. Rather in passion than in earnest, he turned to his faithful porter. Here, Henry, you can do almost anything. Why can't you do this job? Perhaps I could, sir, if I had my tools and the stuff, was the reply. Your tools? Exclaimed the merchant in surprise, for till now he knew nothing of his trade. Boyd explained that he had learned the trade of a carpenter and joiner and had no objection to try the job. The merchant handed him the money and told him to make as good a counter as he could. The work was done with such promptitude, judgment, and finish that his employer broke off a contract for the erection of a large frame warehouse, which he was about closing with the same mechanic who had disappointed him in the matter of the counter, and gave the job to Henry. The money was furnished, and Boyd was left to procure the materials and boss the job at his own discretion. This he found no difficulty in doing, and what is remarkable among the numerous journeymen whom he employed were some of the very men who took off their aprons at his appearance in the Englishman's shop. The merchant was so pleased with his new warehouse that he proceeded to set up the intelligent builder in the exercise of his trade in the city. Thus, Henry Boyd found himself raised at once almost beyond the reach of the prejudice which had well nigh crushed him. He built houses and accumulated property. White journeymen and apprentices were glad to be in his employment and to sit at his table. He is now a wealthy mechanic, living in his own house in Cincinnati, and his enemies, who have tried to supplant him, have as good reason as his friends to know that he is a man of sound judgment and a most vigorous intellect. Without having received a day's schooling in his life, Henry Boyd is well read in history, has an extensive and accurate knowledge of geography, is an excellent arithmetician, and is remarkable for his morality, generosity, and all those traits which mark a noble character. End of section number 65, read by Kevin Waters, Spring Hill, Florida, July 23rd, 2021.
Section 66 of Narratives of Colored Americans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Merritt. Narratives of Colored Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood. Quamino Buccan, a pious Methodist. Quamino was born in the vicinity of New Brunswick, New Jersey, in 1762, and was a slave. In his 9th year, he was hired for a term of years to a person named Skenk, who employed him as a house servant, and who, soon after removing to Poughkeepsie, New York, took the lad with him. The unsettled state of the country during the Revolutionary War prevented communication with his old master, and Quamino had no hope of seeing his former friends. But in his 18th year, he was informed that his master had sent for him. On his return to New Jersey, his old associates had so grown that he felt like a stranger in his old home. When nearing the age of manhood, he was steady in attending religious meetings, walking several miles through all kinds of weather. His own account of his motive in going was that he liked to have the name of being a good boy. But whatever his motive in going, the meetings were a blessing to him. One Sabbath evening, on reaching home, he went to the barn, where, after earnest exercise in prayer, he slept upon the straw. Very early in the morning he went into the field to work, first kneeling by the fence. Being in great distress, the gracious words of the Savior deeply impressed him. Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God. Believe also in me, yielding his whole heart and all his powers to him who was calling for the sacrifice. He felt that he received the unspeakable gift. He went to his work, and oh, said he, everything was glorious around me. Everything seemed to be praising God. The change which had come over the boy was conspicuous to all around him. He was quiet and diligent in attention to all his duty. From this time, Quamino understood the nature of that peace which passeth all understanding. On the Sabbath, he would get the carriage ready, and when his master had started, he would walk several miles across the fields to the Methodist meeting, but always left before the conclusion of the services, as, if not at home in time to take the horses when the family arrived, he was sure to be found fault with, if not punished. At the age of 26, he married Sarah, a slave on a neighboring place. She was soon sold to a distance of 5 miles, and for some years they only met once a week. One Sabbath morning he went to see her, and found that she and her infant had been sold, leaving her little son, a boy nearly 4 years old. She now had a hard master, but through the efforts of her husband she was purchased by a neighbor, and at length, by the removal of this purchaser, Quamino induced his second master, to whom he had been sold when about 30 years old, to buy her. Afterwards, Dr. Griffith bought Quamino for $250 and Sarah for $150. At the death of Dr. Griffith, his goods and chattels, including his slaves, were advertised to be sold at public auction. The sale commenced, and Quamino and Sarah became objects of much attention. But a letter was received from William Griffith, the son and executor of the late master, directing that everything should be sold to the highest bidder, except the carriage and horse, and that, with these, Quamino should bring Sarah to Burlington. "Oh, my dear friend," said he in narrating it, "you do not know how I felt." William Griffith was not only an eminent lawyer, but bore a part in originating the New Jersey Abolition Society. For this excellent man, whose record is on high, Quamino worked to the best of his ability. One day, as he was at work in the garden, he heard his name called, and seeing his master beside him, he modestly said, "Sir, we will describe what took place in the good old man's words. says he. "Would you like to be free?" And I said, "I don't know, sir." He stood in silence for a little while, and I went on working, the same as before. At last he said, "I've made up my mind to give you free." And says I, "You give me free, master?" Oh, it all came on me so unexpected. And then he up and told me all how he would do. "When I call you, you must take your wife by the hand and come into my office." One day he called me to bring my wife. I went in the kitchen and said, "Mother, Mr. Griffith says you must come along with me to the office." She stroked her apron, and we went, and found the office full of gentlemen, and there we stood, as if we were just married. After answering some questions, they went back to their work, and their certificate of freedom was recorded in the clerk's office in Burlington. They were then hired at $10 a month. Quamino was then 44 years old. When asked by some of his old friends if he was happier since he received his freedom, he said, "I don't know much about freedom, but I wouldn't be a slave again if you'd give me the best farm in the Jarseys." In the year 1842, when he was 80 years old, his wife died suddenly. As the remains of Sarah were borne from their humble home, he stood at the door, supported by his crutches, the tears streaming down his cheeks. "Farewell," said he. "I shall see her no more till we meet within the pearl gates." Sarah was not inferior to her husband, to whom she was a helper in spiritual and temporal things. He felt this bereavement keenly. His situation without her was forlorn, living alone in his house, too feeble to dress himself. His son, who was out at service, would put him to bed at night and come in the morning to dress him. Arrangements were made by several families to furnish him with dinner, each taking a particular day, and this plan was pursued for 8 years. His landlord supplied his morning and evening meal until Quamino's sight entirely failed, when a faithful caretaker was provided for him. Charles Tabor, a friend and a minister from Canada, visited him one morning and was fervently engaged in prayer. When he rose from his knees, Quamino exclaimed, "Now I know that my prayer was heard. This morning, after blessing and praising the Master for taking care of me through the night, I asked him to please to send me something to comfort me through the day, and now he sent you to me, oh, my dear friend." Speaking of the evidence of evil around us, he said, "God is his own interpreter and my comforter, and he will make all things plain," referring to his pains. He said, "The Lord is the physician. He has a balm for every wound. It seems, as I sit here, I have a view over Jordan. We must pass Jordan's swelling flood, and then we'll be in the promised land." In reference to his blindness, he said that with his natural sight and comprehension, he had never been able to conceive the half of the glory which should be revealed, or to form a conception of the good things held in store, even for so poor a creature as he felt himself to be. "How long I have to remain in this state," he exclaimed, "the Lord knows. I resign myself in his hands and to his wisdom. Oh, the Lord moves with me so beautiful. I trust the Lord has enabled me to seek and to find his face and favor." Being inquired of concerning his health, he replied that he could not wish to be better, that he was so composed in mind, so calm and peaceable. "Oh, the glorious prospect I have in view! I can't see anything of this world, but there seems to be a hovering around me. If the heart is composed to his will, what can trouble us? Blessed Master, please to give me an insight into thy will." He spoke of the comfort and strength which is afforded him to hear the Scriptures read. "Oh," said he, "if I could only find the words to express the feelings I have when I am alone. And yet I do not feel that I am alone either. He cares for us and provides for us, but he is all in all and over all. He leads us by his Spirit He don't compel us, but enables us. O my blessed Saviour, teach me, teach me the measure of my days, that I may turn my thoughts more to it. But I trust in the Lord that He will prepare me and keep me to the end. William J. Allison called on him one morning. He found the old man, who was 108 years of age, sitting in his chair. He gave his visitor an earnest welcome, and his tongue was eloquent with rejoicing praises of Him who had made him meet for an inheritance with the saints in light. "Glory be to the blessed Master," he cried again and again, clasping his hands like an artless and overjoyed child. On this occasion, and indeed in almost every interview, he devoutly expressed his thankfulness that, although deprived of sight, his reason and memory were spared him, and this was remarkably the case to the last moment of existence. "My dear friend has been to visit me once more," he exclaimed repeatedly after this parting. This was his last conversation with anyone, except a few words to his son and his attendant. In the night he called his son, and with his mental powers apparently clear to the last, and conscious that his end had arrived, his purified and enfranchised spirit deserted the clay tenement. And who can doubt his welcome into the joy of the Lord? A few weeks afterwards, a sermon relating to Quamino was preached by the pastor of the Methodist congregation to which this aged Christian belonged. The text was, "This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and delivered him out of all his troubles." Psalm 34:6. See thy Savior bending over thee, even to old age the same. Set life's one chief end before thee, still to glorify its name, while on himself is fixed thy sight. At evening time there shall be light. End of section 66.
Section 67 of Narratives of Colored Americans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Curtis Richardson. Narratives of Colored Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood. Emancipation in New York. Freedmen of America. Emancipation in New York. The period fixed by law for the termination of slavery in the state of New York was the 4th of July, 1827. According to the census of 1820, there were 20,279 free persons of color and 10,092 slaves in the state, making in all 30,371. The Freedmen of America. During the 4 Years' War commencing 1861, the colored people fled from bondage and gathered in large numbers around Washington and in those parts of Virginia which were in possession of the United States government. Sometimes 1,000 refugees came to the freedmen's settlement in a week, and most of them had traveled on foot for several days with scant food and clothing. They rejoiced greatly when they arrived at a place of refuge and became free men and women. The able-bodied men were employed by the government, but the sick and aged, the women and children, were cared for by different benevolent associations of the churches at the North and West. The Religious Society of Friends always cherished a deep feeling for the enslaved people of color, and after sending agents to ascertain the condition of the freedmen in the camps and quarters assigned to them by the government, they earnestly labored to feed, clothe, and teach those for whom they had long solicited the boon of freedom. Believing some incidents and anecdotes from letters received from the agents of Friends will be interesting to many, the following extracts are presented. It is difficult to make a connected account of our visit among the freedmen at Washington and elsewhere. We went into their cabins, the tents, and the hospitals, looking into the condition of the poor people congregated there. Their stories may be considered almost trifling in themselves, and yet summed up as a whole a people's history. They tell of oft-repeated tale of sorrow, degradation, and oppression and slavery, of hunger and cold, of sickness and suffering, patiently and uncomplainingly borne in their great struggle for freedom. Every sacrifice, every privation seems insignificant compared to the blessed boon of freedom. To them and their children, the good Lord Jesus has at last heard our prayers and sent Uncle Abram to set us free. They come to the Union as little children would to a parent, with perfect confidence that they will be helped. The younger women mostly had their children with them, but the older ones had all come off with relations and friends. In a severe snowstorm, 1,000 arrived, with only the clothes on their backs. Their utter poverty is terrible. During this storm, we had not clothes for the children, who were crying to get out of bed. 900 came yesterday, all ragged. Their masters had not given them clothes, some for a year, others for 2 years. All beg for Bibles. The rope walk is a very long building divided into cabins. It is where the refugees come at first. In each cabin live 4 or 5 families. It is the most interesting place to visit. There are over 500 people there, fresh from slave life and rejoicing over their freedom. Not being able to read, they often burst out as we are reading to them. Well, I never heard that before. The beautiful doctrine of the Golden Rule seems almost new to them. It is true the religious element is very strong in them, but their manner of receiving it is very different from our ideas. Although they may be what they call converted, they need plain words of moral truth for everyday life. They have plenty of faith and thankfulness, but not Christ's law of love in their hearts to govern every action. We stopped at a church and witnessed one of their religious excitements. Women all rocking their bodies and singing weird choruses. Then someone getting excited above the others and throwing herself about, jumping and screaming. We stayed until they were out, and all down the aisles they sang and shouted, real fine, full voices, and the words more strange than all. All the women had that swaying motion so peculiar to them. The boxes were handed over to me on the 19th of January. From that date to the 7th of May, I have given out 2,620 garments, large and small. For the last 10 days, we have been very busy. During the last engagement on the battlefield, hundreds have come, more than can possibly find shelter here. I have witnessed some of the arrivals at the depot. At the sound of the whistle, many anxious hearts and longing eyes are seeking their friends. Here mothers find their long-lost children, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, meet after long separation. One good old mother here found 6 of her children in one group. One poor mother, with 7 children, was inquiring for her husband. The answer was, "He is dead." The smallpox left that record for this poor mother. We saw one noble-looking man, not far from 7 feet high, in mere rags and bare feet. Our number 12s looked like baby shoes beside them, but I heard of a pair of number 19s at the commissary, which they were very glad to exchange. The old man had had a hard master, and had been driven off without food enough to cover a pin. But I never saw such a flash of joy when I said, "But, Uncle, you have such a good, kind master now, and such a beautiful home up in heaven." "Oh, missus, it's just that's stained me all along." They all seemed so grateful. We had a happy day indeed. They learned surprisingly fast. They were very anxious to learn to reckon. I said I would repeat the multiplication table if they would try to remember it. I repeated the 2s once, and they said it after me in concert. I then questioned them, and though they had never heard it before, quite a number remembered the whole. One little fellow, in the school being asked if he knew his letters, said promptly, "Yes, ma'am." "Well, what else do you know?" Drawing up his full height, which might be about 4 feet, he replied, "I know a heap." Freedmen's Village, near Arlington, is really an attractive-looking place. Comfortable houses, nicely whitewashed, a schoolhouse capable of accommodating 200 or 300 children, and a home for the aged and infirm. Fervor and eagerness pervade the sermons and prayers of the colored people here. One gave thanks for the glorious privilege that we ain't all dead, shut up in hell. Some of us might not have realized before that it was a glorious privilege to be still left on earth, either as faithful servants, to do the Master's bidding, or to become reconciled to him before we were snatched away with no alternative but to be shut up in hell. You would have been touched to witness their grief at the death of our beloved president. Every tenanted hut was decked with some badge of mourning. Thousands went to look at their emancipator as he lay in state in the White House. Aunt Cecily, who bore the yoke of slavery 110 years, looked on Mr. Lincoln with a reverential feeling, beautiful to behold in one so aged, for the privilege, she says, that he gave me to die free. Some old men who had learned to read while in slavery said, "We toted Massa's children to school, stayed all day, and then toted them back. We learned to read, and Massa didn't know it. And now we can read the blessed book ourselves. The good people of the North have been very good to us. Jesus, tell them to help the poor slave. By and by we can help ourselves. We thank you all very much." Mother, child, and grandchild sometimes go hand in hand to the schoolroom. The simulating motive with most of the adults is a fervent desire to read the Bible. The marriage record kept among the freedmen shows that a large part of the marriages, especially at first, were of those who had lived together as husband and wife, perhaps many years, without an opportunity to be legally united. One old man, of almost 70, was thus joined in lawful marriage to his venerable wife. At the conclusion of the ceremony, when the pastor extended his hand with the nuptial benediction and dismissed them with a short prayer, they dropped on their knees together, their eyes streaming with tears of thankfulness, and still kneeling, the old man reached out both arms and hugged her to his heart, saying aloud, "My dear old woman, I bless God that I can now, for the first time, kiss my own lawful wife." An agent under date 5th month, 1863 writes, "When I first wrote to thee, the supply of excellent clothing furnished by New York friends and other quarters seemed so ample that, to my eyes, the subject of further need did not suggest itself. I thought the time must come when such wants must be satisfied. But that time draws not yet. The hospitals for colored people are a heavy drain on the clothing. Now that the army advances, there are daily arrivals of freedmen. They come with only the clothing they have on, and must have a change to preserve health." End of section 67.
Section 68 of Narratives of Colored Americans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Khoh. Narratives of Colored Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood. Letters from a Lady Agent in Richmond, 1866. In my jaunt to Deep Creek and to the poor cabins in Dismal Swamp, I helped mend 6 bridges before our horse could cross, borrowing rails from the fence. It was a very hard trip. No chance for a single dinner while gone, but it paid. The same night I mended bridges, I found work of a different kind. Going on business to the Butte Street Church, I found a love feast under full headway. About 200 were present. The excitement terrible among the young converts who, in their frantic leaps, broke lamps and windows and filled the house with perfect uproar. I found the new pastor dared not risk his popularity by checking it. Courage was given me to make my way to the pulpit, where I at once had permission to speak. All was still as need be, while I appealed to their judgment and the teachings of the Bible. I saw I had the sympathy of most, and when at last I said, "Wait till the wind and the earthquake and the fire have all passed by, and then go to your homes and listen to the still small voice by which God himself will teach you. And oh, remember, my young sisters, that the proof of your growth in grace is not the feelings you have here tonight, but the life you will lead tomorrow." There was such an earnest "Amen" all over the house as gave me hope again that they will rise above this great delusion. Many came to thank me. It was just what we needed, and they will hear it from you. Deeply impressed with the moral wants of these poor creatures, especially the women, and their need of friendly counsel in their new position, I have opened mothers' meetings, now held weekly in each of our 3 school districts, where they are invited to come with their work and their babies. I talk familiarly with them about their household matters, the cheapest and most wholesome food, the best ways of cooking it, and the right care of their children and their duties to their husbands, often being greatly helped out in my own stock of knowledge by the practical experience of some nice old auntie who tells how she manages till the whole group is at ease and can confide their troubles and trials. Then I read, teach, or talk to them. Finally, all lay aside their work, and the babies are hushed up, while they listen to a chapter from the Bible, and the devotional pause at the close is solemn and impressive. Those who cannot spare 2 or 3 hours hurry in at the last, and I hear them saying, "I's just going over to prayers, 'pears it gives me such a lift." End of section 68.
Section 69 of Narratives of Colored Americans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Narratives of Colored Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood. Love for the Bible and Hymn sung at Christmas. Love for the Bible. At a great fire in the city of New York, 100 houses had been burned. Dr. Eli overtook a colored woman who was carrying under one arm a bundle of wood and under the other a large Bible. "Poor woman," said he, "have you been burned out too?" "Yes, sir," said she, "but blessed be God, I'm alive." "You are very old to be turned out of house and home." "I'm well stricken in years, but God does it." "Have you saved nothing but the Bible?" "Nothing," said she, "but one trunk of things. But this blessed book is worth more than all the rest. It makes me feel better than all the rest. So long as I keep this, I am content." End of Love for the Bible. Hymn sung at Christmas by the scholars at St. Helena's Island, South Carolina. Oh, none in all the world before were ever glad as we. We're free on Carolina's shore, we're all at home and free. Thou friend and helper of the poor, who suffered for our sake, to open every prison door and every yoke to break. Bend low thy pitying face and mild, and help us sing and pray the hand that blessed the little child upon our foreheads lay. We hear no more the driver's horn, no more the whip we fear. This holy day that saw thee born was never half so dear. The very oaks are greener clad, the waters brighter smile. Oh, never shone a day so glad on sweet St. Helen's Isle. We praise thee in our songs today, to thee in prayer we call. Make swift the feet and straight the way of freedom unto all. Come once again, O blessed Lord, come walking on the sea, and let the mainlands hear the word that sets the islands free. J. G. Whittier. End of Hymn Sung at Christmas. End of section 69.
Section 70 of Narratives of Colored Americans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Narratives of Colored Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood. A Temperance Meeting in Africa. James Backhouse, an English friend and a minister, published a journal of his mission in Africa, in which he says, under the date of December 1st, 1838, "This is the memorable day in which slavery ceased in Cape Colony, South Africa. We arrived at Hankey in time to join a considerable congregation of those who had been in bondage, natives of Madagascar and Mozambique, as well as home-born slaves. They had come from the surrounding country to unite with those on the mission station in praising God for their deliverance from bondage. In the evening a meeting was held, when several Hottentots, natives of South Africa, and freedmen addressed the congregation. The next day was a Sabbath day, and truly a high day. About 500 freed slaves and Hottentots assembled early in the morning. They held a prayer meeting, in which the language of thanksgiving was held forth by one lately in slavery, and appropriate hymns were sung. I exhorted the liberated to seek through Jesus Christ deliverance from that worst of bondage, slavery to sin. In the evening of the third day, a temperance tea meeting was held in the chapel. A suspended wheel tire was struck for a bell to call them to assemble. The men sat at the tables on one side of the chapel, and the women at the other side. Tea and cakes were dealt out by some of the women. All were remarkably clean and conducted themselves with sober cheerfulness and looks full of interest. After the missionary had returned thanks and made a brief address, it was my privilege to follow him in recommending total abstinence from intoxicating liquors. Several Hottentots and freed slaves then addressed the meeting, which afterwards adjourned for a short interval at milking time. On reassembling, George W. Walker spoke at some length, and several others. At 10:30, the missionary suggested that it would be unseasonable to continue the meeting longer. He therefore opened a book of signatures to the total abstinence pledge, and 160 new names were received. As neither my companion G. W. Walker nor I had hitherto signed such a pledge, we also added our names. A sweet sense of the love of God overshadowed this meeting. Some attention had been paid to temperance from the early institution of this settlement. The children have so little idea of what drunkenness is, that in 1842, when an Englishman appeared in a state of intoxication, some of them ran away, thinking he was mad. Others thought he must be ill because he staggered, but others feared he was blind and offered to lead him. At the expiration of a year from this period, only one of the persons who signed the pledge on this day was known to have broken it, and that only to the amount of taking a single glass of wine. End of section 70.
Section 71 of Narratives of Colored Americans. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Narratives of Colored Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood. Liberty to the Captive. Written on the anniversary of British Emancipation. O Holy Father, just and true are all thy works and words and ways, and unto thee alone are due thanksgiving and eternal praise. As children of thy gracious care, we veil the eye, we bend the knee, with broken words of praise and prayer. Father and God, we come to thee. For thou hast heard, O God of right, the sighing of the island slave, and stretched for him the arm of might, not shortened that it could not save. The laborer sits beneath his vine, the shackled soul and hands are free. Thanksgiving, for the work is thine. Praise, for the blessing is of thee. Whittier. End of section 71. End of Narratives of Colored Americans by Abigail Mott and M.S. Wood.